For over 3,000 years, a young king lay hidden beneath the desert sands, his tomb sealed in silence, untouched by human hands. Tutankhamun, barely a teenager, ruled an empire in flux. He was fragile in body, yet destined for an eternity preserved in gold. Inside his burial chamber, dazzling treasures conceal a deeper truth. This isn't just a story of power, but one of vulnerability, care, and ritual precision, all designed to protect a delicate life. Beyond the glitter and the legend lies a quiet world of objects and symbols. They reveal not just the might of a pharaoh, but the mortality, fear, and the incredible lengths an ancient civilization went to safeguard its most cherished, and perhaps most fragile, ruler. Join us as we uncover the real story behind. Gold was never meant to be the most important thing inside Tutankhamun's tomb. Yet, it was the first thing the world noticed. When that sealed doorway was breached in 1922, light spilled into a space untouched for over 3,000 years. It reflected back a brilliance so intense, it seemed unreal. But beneath all that gold, beneath the masks, the shrines, the jeweled coffins, something far more fragile was waiting. Something human, something forgotten. The tomb didn't open with a dramatic ceremony. It opened with dust, silence, and uncertainty. Howard Carter peered through a small hole, his candle trembling. When asked if he saw anything, his reply became legendary. Yes, wonderful things. But what he didn't say, what no one could see yet, was that those wonderful things told a quiet, uncomfortable story. This wasn't the tomb of a conquering hero. It was the resting place of a boy who had suffered, been protected, and then hidden away by time. Tutankhamun was never meant to be remembered like this. He ruled briefly, left no great monuments, and won no famous wars. By history's standards, he should have vanished. Yet his tomb survived when so many others were looted and destroyed. That survival wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate care, secrecy, and an almost anxious attention to detail. Every object inside was chosen not for display, but for protection. Take the famous gold mask. We see it as a symbol of power, but it was also a shield. Its heavy weight pressed down on a fragile skull. Its serene expression hid a body that had struggled to walk, a spine that curved, and bones weakened by illness. The linen wrappings underneath were layered thickly, soaked in resin, and hardened almost to stone, not just to preserve, but to stabilize what had been weak even in life. And look closer at the walls. They were lined with walking sticks, not just ceremonial ones, but worn, used supports. This wasn't symbolism, this was evidence. The boy king leaned on these in life, and they followed him into death. Alongside them were games, toys, small personal objects, things that belonged not to a mighty ruler, but to someone who never truly left childhood behind. The tomb's layout itself reveals a sense of urgency. Unlike the vast, orderly tombs of great pharaohs, this space was cramped, rushed, almost improvised. Objects were stacked, overlapping, pressed together. It was as if those preparing the burial knew their time was short. Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, and Egypt scrambled to give him what eternity demanded. The result wasn't perfection, but it was sincerity. What the world mistook for luxury was, in truth, compensation. Gold replaced strength. Ritual replaced longevity. Magic replaced medicine. The ancient Egyptians believed the afterlife demanded wholeness. If a body was weak in life, it had to be fortified in death. Amulets were placed strategically over the heart, the limbs, the throat. Spells were inscribed to guard against dangers the living couldn't prevent. Even the nested coffins tell this story. Layer after layer, enclosing the body again and again, as if distance itself were protection. The innermost coffin, made of solid gold, was less a display of wealth and more a final barrier, an attempt to keep decay, danger, and disturbance at bay forever. And for thousands of years, it worked. Sand buried the entrance. Workers' huts collapsed over it. Other tombs nearby were robbed, but this one slipped from memory. Time sealed it better than stone ever could. When the tomb was finally opened, the modern world brought noise with it. Cameras, headlines, and myths. The so-called curse distracted from the real truth. But the tomb never threatened anyone. It only revealed. Modern science would later confirm what the artifacts had whispered all along. Tutankhamun's body bore signs of disease, injury, and genetic weakness. He lived in pain, he ruled while struggling, and his death came young. This is the forgotten truth beneath the gold. The tomb is not a monument to dominance, it is a monument to care. It shows us an ancient world that didn't just hide weakness, but responded to it, surrounding a fragile ruler with protection, comfort, and meaning. The gold dazzles the eyes, but it's the quiet details, the worn wood of a cane, the child-sized sandals, the hurried stacking of sacred objects that revealed the real story. A story not of power, but of vulnerability, preserved against impossible odds. To understand what lies beneath the gold, we must step back before the burial, before the silence, before the seals were set in place. We have to return to the life of Tutankhamun himself, life shaped not by strength or ambition, but by fragility from the very beginning. He was born into a royal household already burdened by obsession and tradition. His lineage, carefully guarded to preserve divine blood, had weakened him long before he ever wore a crown. Tutankhamun was the product of generations of close kinship within Egypt's royal family. This practice, meant to maintain purity, carried hidden costs. Modern science would later reveal what the ancient embalmers seemed to know. His body struggled. His bones were thin. His foot was malformed. His immune system was fragile. Walking was painful. Balance was uncertain. Childhood illnesses lingered into adolescence. Yet despite all this, at around 9 years old, he was crowned king. The image of a child ruler often conjures visions of innocence guided by wise hands. In reality, Tutankhamun's reign was one of quiet dependence. Advisors, priests, and court officials surrounded him, steering the state while shielding the boy from the burdens of rule. But his physical condition couldn't be hidden. Relief carvings and statues often show him seated or leaning, supported subtly by a staff or attendant. These weren't symbolic flourishes, they were accommodations. Inside the tomb, this reality becomes impossible to ignore. The walking sticks, more than 100 of them, are not decorative excess. Many are worn smooth where hands once gripped them daily. Some show signs of long-term use, repaired rather than replaced. These were tools of survival, not symbols of authority. Their presence in death reflects a belief that the afterlife would demand the same physical efforts as life itself. Tutankhamun's health shaped his world. Even the way he moved through palaces and temples would have been carefully managed. Long processions and standing rituals were likely shortened or avoided. His kingship was quiet, inward, protected. In many ways, he lived more as a guarded child than a commanding ruler. Yet this vulnerability did not diminish his importance. If anything, it heightened their sense of responsibility. The ancient Egyptians believed the pharaoh was a linchpin of cosmic balance. A fragile king meant the state must work harder to maintain order. Rituals intensified, protective magic multiplied, care became systematic. This mindset carried directly into his burial. The people who prepared Tutankhamun for eternity were not surprised by his condition. They planned for it. His body was treated with extraordinary measures. Thick layers of resin reinforced his bones and stiffened his joints, creating a form that could endure beyond decay. His limbs were bound with precision, his posture corrected for eternity. Amulets were chosen with intention. Symbols of healing, rebirth, and protection dominated the wrappings. The Eye of Horus, for restoration. The scarab, for regeneration. The jade pillar, representing stability and, especially telling choice for a king who lacked it in life. These were not generic inclusions. They were targeted responses to known weaknesses. Even the food and drink offerings suggest an awareness of deprivation. Rich meats, wine, and fruit comforts a sickly king may have been denied in life were promised in abundance beyond death. The afterlife was imagined as compensation, a place where what was lacking could finally be restored. His father Akhenaten had radically disrupted Egyptian tradition, abandoning old gods and destabilizing the kingdom. By the time Tutankhamun ascended the throne, the nation was fragile, uncertain, eager for balance. The boy king became a symbol of restoration, not because of his strength, but because of his innocence. His vulnerability made him acceptable, malleable, safe. In death, he became something more powerful still. His burial reunited tradition and ritual. It corrected the chaos of the previous generation. The tomb was not just a resting place, it was a political and spiritual apology. A return to order, sealed in stone. And yet, despite all this care, there is an unmistakable sadness woven through the tomb. The toys suggest a childhood cut short. The small sandals speak of feet that struggled. The hurried construction hints at grief, mixed with urgency. This was not the burial of a man who had lived fully. It was the farewell of a life interrupted. Beneath the gold, beneath the ritual, beneath the layers of protection, lies the truth. Tutankhamun was deeply human. Fragile, dependent, loved, The tomb preserves not the illusion of power, but the reality of vulnerability and the extraordinary lengths a civilization went to protect it. And as we move deeper into the tomb's chambers, another truth begins to emerge. This was not just a response to death, it was a carefully crafted answer to fear of loss, of chaos, of forgetting. The next chamber does not merely hold objects, it holds intention. Before we even look at a single golden artifact, Tutankhamun's tomb tells us a profound story. Its very walls, the narrow corridors, the cramped rooms, they all whisper of urgency, of hands racing against the clock, of decisions made under immense pressure. If you compare it to the grand, sprawling tombs of other powerful pharaohs, Tutankhamun's resting place feels surprisingly modest, almost apologetic. It wasn't designed for eternity, it was adapted for it. The truth is, Tutankhamun died suddenly, and Egypt was caught completely off guard. Pharaohs usually spent decades planning their journey into the afterlife. They would commission vast underground palaces meant to project their power long after they were gone. But Tutankhamun had no such luxury. His reign was short, his future was always uncertain, and his own tomb was far from finished. What we see today is likely not what was originally intended for him at all. Many historians believe this tomb was repurposed, perhaps from one meant for a high-ranking noble or even a queen. The layout is unusual. The corridors are short. The chambers feel tightly packed. Objects are crammed together, overlapping in a way that feels wrong. This isn't the architecture of confidence and careful planning, it's the architecture of absolute necessity. The people in charge of his burial had to act fast. There was no time to start a new construction project. Death had arrived before the blueprints were even finalized. Once you step inside, the sense of organized chaos is striking. You see massive golden shrines blocking passageways, ornate furniture is leaned haphazardly against walls. Even his magnificent chariots had to be dismantled, just to fit them through the doors. Sacred items are stacked on top of each other, rather than being displayed with reverence. To our modern eyes, it looks like a mess, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was perfectly acceptable. Why? Because completeness mattered more than perfection. In their belief system, every single ritual item had to be present for the king's journey to the afterlife to succeed. Even if the arrangement was a bit clumsy, nothing could be left behind. This feeling of urgency carries a real emotional weight. You can almost feel the pressure on the embalmers, the priests, and the officials. Their young king was gone. The entire state needed to project an image of stability. The sacred rituals demanded absolute precision. There was no room for error. And yet, you can see the fingerprints of real people, working under incredible strain, making it all happen. The walls themselves tell a more muted story. Unlike other royal tombs that are filled with elaborate carved texts and detailed scenes from the Book of the Dead, Tutankhamun's walls are sparse. The artwork is simple, almost hastily executed. The figures are painted, not carved into the stoner, clear, time-saving measure. The color palette is limited. These weren't artistic choices, they were practical ones. Even so, the scenes they chose to paint are very telling. They don't focus on military triumphs or grand conquests. Instead, they focus on transition, on the rituals of passage into the next world. The king isn't shown as a mighty ruler, but as a soul being led, protected, and embraced by the gods. The emphasis is on care, not dominance. This theme continues when you look at the sarcophagus. The burial chamber is so tight, it can barely accommodate the nested golden shrines that surround the coffin. To get them inside, the workers actually had to dismantle parts of the shrines, move them into the chamber piece by piece, and then reassemble them. This was risky, difficult, and labor-intensive work, but they did it anyway. Protection was more important than convenience. These nested shrines create a pattern of increasing isolation. Each layer separates the king further from the outside world. Sound, light, and touch are progressively blocked out. This was completely intentional. Silence wasn't just a byproduct of being buried, it was the goal. The afterlife required stillness, stability, and a total separation from the chaos of the living world. The incredible care taken during the embalming process reinforces this idea. Tutankhamun's body was treated with extreme caution. His organs were preserved with unusual attention to detail. A huge amount of resin was poured over his mummy, sealing the body so thoroughly that it hardened into a solid mass. This made it very difficult for Howard Carter and his team to examine the body, but it also ensured its long-term preservation. The embalmers weren't thinking about future archaeologists, they were thinking about eternity. Even the location of the tomb speaks to the rush. It's situated low in the Valley of the Kings, in an area that was vulnerable to flash floods. This was far from an ideal spot, but the higher, more prestigious locations were already taken by other pharaohs. Once again, time forced a compromise. The burial had to happen, and any delay was seen as dangerous. But despite all these compromises, something remarkable emerges. Nothing essential was left out. Not a single ritual was skipped. No protective amulet was forgotten. Even under the most intense pressure, the ancient Egyptians fulfilled their sacred obligations to their king. In their worldview, the journey to the afterlife was unforgiving. Every single requirement had to be met, or the king's soul would be lost forever. The fact that they achieved this under such difficult circumstances speaks volumes about their culture and their devotion. So, the tomb isn't a failure of planning, it's a triumph of adaptability. It reveals a society capable of responding to a crisis with profound care and efficiency. Faced with the sudden death of their young, fragile king, they didn't panic. They acted, they adjusted, and they preserved what mattered most. This rushed burial also happens to be the very reason the tomb survived for over 3,000 years. Its small size made it easy to hide. Debris from the construction of a later tomb, that of Ramesses VI, completely covered its entrance. Workers' huts were built right on top of it, and in time, its location was completely forgotten. The very haste that defined its creation became its ultimate shield. There's a certain poetry in that, isn't there? A king who was perhaps too fragile to leave a huge mark on history was protected by the very circumstances that favored humility over grandeur. His tomb survived, not because it was the biggest or the best, but because it was overlooked. Silence became its guardian. And so, as we move through this confined, precious space, we begin to understand the deeper truth hidden beneath all the gold. This tomb isn't about showing off wealth. It's about urgency, care, and quiet determination. It is a culture's response to sudden loss, executed with incredible discipline and devotion. The people who sealed this tomb knew they were racing against time. What they couldn't have known was that time, once it was sealed out, would become their greatest ally. Beyond this burial chamber, there's more than just treasure. There's evidence of a civilization responding to fragility with incredible intention. And in the next space, among the countless objects pressed together in haste, we find signs not just of preparation, but of fear, belief, and enduring hope, all entwined. Once you step inside Tutankhamun's tomb, the objects begin to speak, telling a story far more profound than any inscription on the walls. At first glance, it looks like chaos. Items are packed tightly, layered without symmetry, and squeezed into every available inch of space. But this wasn't clutter. It was preparation. This dense collection of artifacts is a language of belief, a system designed to protect a fragile soul on its journey through a dangerous, unseen world. To the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't a peaceful paradise waiting for you. It was a place filled with trials, judgments, and terrifying threats. Monsters lurked in the darkness. The soul could get lost. It could starve. It could even be completely erased from existence. To survive, you needed the right tools, specialized knowledge, and powerful protection. Tutankhamun's tomb is like the ultimate checklist against oblivion, a meticulously prepared survival kit for eternity. Among the most revealing objects are the beds, carved with the heads of protective gods and fierce hybrid creatures. These were never meant for simple rest. They were ritual platforms. It was on these beds that the king's body would be symbolically reborn, transitioning from one state of being to another. The fearsome designs weren't just decorations, they were guardians, meant to scare away any unseen dangers that threatened this sacred process. Nearby, chariots were found dismantled, stacked almost awkwardly against the walls. These were more than just vehicles for war or royal parades. They represented mobility, the freedom to move through a realm where a soul could easily become trapped. For a king who, in life, likely struggled to walk due to physical ailments, the inclusion of 6 chariots carries a heavy, poignant meaning. In death, he would finally move without pain, swift and unhindered. Chests and baskets were overflowing with clothing. Linen garments, sandals, even gloves, some child-sized, others ceremonial. This wasn't just a king's extravagant wardrobe. It was about being ready for what comes next. He couldn't appear before the gods improperly dressed. The sheer quantity of clothing suggests a deep anxiety about vulnerability. To be naked, unprepared, or exposed in the next world was to be in grave danger. This fear of lack is reinforced by the food offerings. Hundreds of jars of wine, Precious oils, grains, dried meats, and fruits were all carefully sealed. In the Egyptian afterlife, the dead didn't automatically receive nourishment. Hunger was a very real threat, another trial to overcome. The provisions in Tutankhamun's tomb were meant to ensure that earthly needs would not follow him as weaknesses beyond this life. Even comfort was repetized, but the tomb also contained weapons, bows, arrows, daggers. These weren't for conquest, but for self-defense. The journey through the afterlife demanded strength, even from a king who may have been physically weak. While magic was a powerful aid, physical symbols of defense still held immense importance. These objects acknowledged the presence of danger without ever glorifying violence. The amulets, however, tell the most intimate story of all. Dozens were placed directly onto the king's mummified body, each one chosen for a specific purpose. An amulet to protect the heart, another for the stability of the spine. Amulets to give strength to his limbs, breath to his lungs, and the power of speech to his mouth. This wasn't simple superstition. It was a form of spiritual anatomy, filtered through a system of profound belief. Every known weakness of the human body was addressed with a specific magical countermeasure. Perhaps the most telling of all is the heart scarab. This large amulet was placed directly over the king's chest, and it was inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead. This spell was a direct command to the heart, ordering it not to testify against the king during the final judgment. In Egyptian belief, your own heart could betray you, recounting all your misdeeds. For someone whose life was marked by physical struggle, this was a profoundly personal inclusion. It suggests a fear not of divine punishment, but of personal failure, of his own body letting him down one last time. The famous golden mask is often misunderstood. We see its serene, perfect expression and think of power and wealth. But it represents something else, completion. It shows Tutankhamun not as he was in his short, difficult life, but as he was meant to be in eternity, perfect, whole, divinely balanced. In a way, the mask is an act of mercy. It grants the appearance of flawless strength to a young man who rarely, if ever, possessed it. The king's body was nested within layers upon layers of coffins and shrines, each one isolating him further from the chaos of the outside world. Every layer reduced the risk. Every barrier added another level of security. This was an architecture of reassurance. If one line of magical defense failed, another would hold. Even the canopic jars, which housed his preserved organs, reflect this deep level of care. Their lids bear the faces of protective deities, each one guarding a vital part of his being. The organs weren't discarded. They were essential components of the soul, and nothing could be lost. All of this points to a central truth. The people who prepared this tomb were deeply afraid. But they weren't afraid of the king. They were afraid for him. In this context, fear isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of awareness. An awareness of fragility, of risk, and of the fact that love and responsibility don't simply end with death. The objects in this tomb form a conversation between the living and the dead. They whisper across the millennia, "We know the world is dangerous. We know you are vulnerable. We have done everything in our power to protect you." This is why the tomb, despite its incredible riches, feels so intimate. It's not cold or distant. It's anxious, caring, and deeply intentional. The gold isn't about arrogance, it's insulation against the unknown. The magic isn't fantasy, it's a practical preparation for a perilous journey. And yet, for all this planning, the tomb was never meant to be opened by human hands. These messages of love and fear were private, sealed away with the belief that they would only be seen by the gods. When the modern world broke that seal in 1922, it stepped into a conversation it was never supposed to hear. What we found was not a story of dominance or kingly power, but a story of fear met with devotion. These objects don't boast, they protect, they compensate for weakness. They reveal a civilization that understood human fragility and responded not with dismissal, but with incredible, loving care. And as we look beyond these ancient objects, toward the moment that silence was finally broken, another layer of the story emerges. This time, it's not one written by ancient hands, but by modern ones. A story of discovery, of misunderstanding, and of the true cost of awakening, something that had been left to rest in peace for over 3,000 years. November 1922, a faint crack appears in a sealed doorway, lost to time for over 3,000 years. The air inside, still and silent since the Bronze Age, shifts for the first time, carrying the faint scent of resin, dust, and unimaginable age. At the threshold stands Howard Carter, peering into the darkness. He knows he's not just a discoverer, he is an intruder, trespassing on a moment never meant for modern eyes. What he sees is not just a room full of treasure, it's an interruption of eternity. The antechamber is overwhelming. Gold glints back at his candlelight from every direction. Chariots, statues, and ornate chests are piled high, a scene of chaotic, theatrical splendor. It's mythic for a world exhausted by war and hungry for spectacle. This is irresistible. Headlines exploded across the globe. Photographs were passed from hand to hand. Tutankhamun's tomb became a worldwide obsession. But with this fascination came a deep misunderstanding. The modern world looked for signs of a mighty pharaoh, a conqueror defined by power and wealth. What they saw, they labeled extravagance. The real story, one written in fragility, in compensation, in profound care, was almost completely missed. The tomb was treated like a treasure chest, not a message from the past. Carter himself was torn. He was a meticulous professional, deeply respectful of the artifacts, but even he couldn't escape the pressures of his time. The world wanted to see the treasure, so objects were catalogued, removed, and put on display. Their context, their meaning within the silent tomb, was shattered. The stillness and peace intended for the boy king could not survive this new exposure. As the excavation continued, a new story began to take shape, the myth of the pharaoh's curse. Any death, even loosely connected to the team, was sensationalized. The idea that the tomb itself was punishing those who disturbed it captured the public's imagination. It was a thrilling, dramatic tale, but the curse narrative was a distraction from the real damage being done. It wasn't about supernatural vengeance. It was about simple erosion. The light from torches and cameras faded ancient pigments. The rush of fresh air altered delicate materials. Every touch, no matter how careful, accelerated decay. The tomb was designed to last forever through perfect isolation. Modern curiosity dismantled that isolation, piece by piece. In a way, the curse myth was an expression of guilt. It was a subconscious acknowledgement that something sacred had been violated. The ancient Egyptians believed the dead needed peace to achieve eternity. We dismissed this as superstition, yet the consequences of our intrusion proved very real. As the artifacts were separated, they lost their relationships to each other. A collection of walking sticks stopped being evidence of a young king's physical struggles and just became sticks. Intricate toys were no longer symbols of a childhood cut short, but simple curiosities. Amulets designed to protect the body in the afterlife became just jewelry. The meaning thinned out as the objects were removed from their silent home. And what of the boy king himself? Tutankhamun became an icon, a brand, not a person. His golden mask toured the world, gleaming under artificial lights in museum cases. Millions marveled at its beauty, but few knew that it once pressed down on a skull so fragile, it likely fractured under its own weight. The mask was no longer a shield for the afterlife. It was a spectacle, stripped of its original, sacred purpose. Decades later, science brought a new kind of clarity. Advanced CT scans and genetic testing allowed researchers to re-examine Tutankhamun's body without causing more damage. They found evidence of bone deformities, a club foot, and inherited conditions like malaria. The narrative slowly began to shift away from curses and conquest, toward a more human story of vulnerability and the immense care taken to protect this fragile king. But the damage was done. The tomb could never return to its silence. It had entered history in a new way, not as a preserved sanctuary, but as a global artifact. Its story now belongs to all of us, for better and for worse, and preserving what remains is an ongoing battle against the very exposure that made it famous. There's a deep irony in this. The very qualities that made Tutankhamun fragile in life, his physical ailments, his dependence on others, are what ensured his name would survive. The tombs of stronger, more powerful pharaohs were looted centuries ago. Their grand monuments were dismantled for other projects. But this quiet, almost hidden tomb, sealed in a hurry, remained intact just long enough to teach us a lesson no grand pyramid ever could. The world expected to find a story of ancient power, but instead, it found a mirror. Looking at Tutankhamun, we see our own reflection, our obsession with spectacle, our discomfort with weakness, our impatience with anything subtle or complex. The tomb challenges these instincts. It asks us to slow down, to listen, to reconsider what greatness really means. And maybe that's why it still fascinates us. Not just because it glitters with gold, but because it contradicts our expectations. It refuses to fit into a simple narrative of power. It insists on complexity. It asks us to see that a legacy can be built on care, not just conquest. The moment that seal was broken, it wasn't just silence that was shattered. A conversation began, one that spans millennia. One side speaks in gold, resin, and ritual. The other responds with cameras, theories, and myths. The truth is somewhere in between, waiting patiently to be heard. As we look beyond the initial thrill of discovery, we realize the greatest legacy of Tutankhamun's tomb isn't what it reveals about the ancient past, but what it continues to reveal about us. For over a century, the golden mask of Tutankhamun has stared back at us, a symbol of unimaginable wealth and ancient mystery. He was the boy king, entombed in splendor, his story buried under layers of gold and speculation. But what if the gold wasn't just for show? What if the tomb's true treasure wasn't the riches, but a story of human fragility, a story we've only just begun to read? For decades, Tutankhamun was more myth than man. When his tomb was opened, the world saw a spectacle. But the first examinations of his mummy were clumsy, invasive. His body was unwrapped, damaged, his bones separated. Even then, the first clues emerged: a curved spine, thin limbs, signs of past injuries. He wasn't the powerful pharaoh of legend. He was frail. But it took the 21st century to finally let the boy king speak. Using modern CT scans, scientists could finally see through the linen wraps without causing more harm. And what they found was astonishing. It wasn't the portrait of a mighty warrior. It was the story of a young man who lived in constant pain. His left foot was severely deformed, a condition that would have made every step agonizing. Suddenly, the hundreds of walking sticks found in his tomb made sense. They weren't just ceremonial symbols of power. They were medical necessities. He couldn't walk without them. His bones also showed signs of a vascular necrosis, a painful disease where bone tissue dies from a lack of blood. Standing for long periods would have been torture. Then, genetic analysis revealed another piece of the puzzle. Tutankhamun was the product of a close family union, a common practice for Egyptian royalty, but one with severe consequences. This inbreeding likely left him with a compromised immune system. In fact, scientists found DNA from the malaria parasite in his remains, suggesting he battled severe, recurring infections. So what about his death? For years, conspiracy theories swirled. An early X-ray seemed to show a skull fracture, sparking tales of assassination. Was the boy king murdered for his throne? The CT scans gave us a clear answer: no. The damage to his skull almost certainly happened during the mummification process, or by early excavators. There was no evidence of a blow to the head. Tutankhamun's death wasn't a palace intrigue. It was a tragic combination of genetic weakness, debilitating disease, and likely a sudden injury, perhaps a bad leg fracture, that his fragile body just couldn't overcome. This new understanding changes everything we thought we knew about his tomb. The objects within are no longer just symbols of wealth. They are clues to his life. The canes were for support. The chariots, which he couldn't have ridden in battle, were perhaps a dream of the mobility he never had. The countless protective amulets weren't just for the afterlife. They were a desperate attempt to shield a body that was physically unstable in this life. Even the famous nested coffins, one inside the other like a Russian doll, take on a profound new meaning. His body was fragile in life, so in death, it was encased in layer after layer of protection. The gold wasn't arrogance, it was armor. It was reinforcement for a king who had none. These scientific discoveries have done something incredible. They've given us back the human being. Tutankhamun is no longer a distant golden icon. He's a young man who ruled one of the world's greatest empires while leaning on a cane, a teenager who bore the weight of a crown while his own body was failing him. He likely sat through long ceremonies, exhausted and in pain. His authority didn't come from physical strength, but from his divine position and from the constant care of those around him. This story challenges our modern obsession with strength and conquest. Tutankhamun wasn't a great warrior. He didn't expand the empire. Yet, his legacy has outshone that of far more powerful pharaohs. Why? Because science has revealed a story that is deeply, profoundly relatable. It's a story of navigating life with limitations, and this transforms our understanding of the tomb's message. It wasn't just a vault for the dead. It was a monument to accommodation. It shows us a society that recognized its leaders' vulnerability and responded with incredible structure, ritual, and empathy. Ancient Egypt, often seen as rigid and unforgiving, reveals a softer side of culture that moved mountains of stone and gold to protect its weakest king. This also forces us to reconsider the infamous curse of the pharaohs. The real danger was never some supernatural wrath. The real danger was misunderstanding. The myths of a vengeful spirit distracted us from the tomb's true purpose. It wasn't meant to threaten, it was meant to help, to provide for, to preserve a life that had been so difficult. Science, in a beautiful twist of irony, has brought us closer to the ancient mindset. It shows that the embalmers weren't just following rote rituals, they were careful observers. They knew Tutankhamun's weaknesses, and they responded with meticulous care. But science also reveals a tragic loss. The damage done by those first, hurried examinations can't be undone. Parts of the mummy were broken, lost forever. The price of our early curiosity was harm. This tension between preservation and disturbance, care and intrusion is the story of Tutankhamun's legacy. As research continues, the boy king is no longer a puzzle to be solved, but a person to be understood. His tomb is not a treasure box, but a carefully constructed answer to the question of how to care for a fragile life. The silence that once protected him has been broken, but in its place, through science, a new kind of respect is emerging. It's a respect that listens to the evidence, rather than chasing sensational headlines. And as we look at what our modern tools have shown us, a powerful question emerges. If an ancient civilization could recognize vulnerability and respond with such extraordinary care, what is our responsibility today? How do we choose to tell this story? The tale of Tutankhamun is no longer about a curse or hidden gold. It's about a boy who ruled as a king, lived as a patient, and left behind a timeless lesson in empathy, written in stone and gold. Why is Tutankhamun the most famous pharaoh? It's a strange question when you think about it. His reign was short, his impact was minor. Other pharaohs ruled longer, built grander monuments, and won bigger battles. By all traditional measures, he should be a forgotten footnote in history. Yet their names have faded while his became immortal. The answer to this paradox reveals a surprising truth about legacy. It's not always about power or conquest. Sometimes, it's about preservation. Tutankhamun's secret to eternal fame was that he was hidden. This anonymity was his shield. And so, when his tomb was finally opened in 1922, the world didn't just find a king, it found a moment frozen in time. Think about what that means. For the first time, modern humanity could step into an ancient royal burial almost exactly as it had been left thousands of years before. This wasn't a museum reconstruction pieced together from fragments. We weren't just looking at artifacts. We were standing in the very room where they were placed, breathing the same still air. But the story goes deeper than just a lucky discovery. The reason Tutankhamun's fame has endured lies in his relative. Let's be honest, it's hard to relate to godlike emperors who reshaped continents. But Tutankhamun, he was different. He was young, possibly just a teenager when he died. He was frail, suffering from various health issues, including a clubfoot that required him to use a walking cane. He was dependent on his advisors. These are not qualities of a distant, intimidating ruler. They are human vulnerabilities. We see a reflection of ourselves, not in the all-powerful conqueror, but in the young man navigating limitations. His tomb reflects this humanity. It's not filled with grand self-aggrandizing propaganda. Instead, it's packed with personal items. We find his clothes, his childhood games, the very walking sticks he leaned on. These objects tell a story not of ideology, but of daily life. They invite empathy. You can almost feel the presence of the person who used them. This personal connection is what makes his story resonate so powerfully. We feel like we know him. The timing of his discovery also played a crucial role. Picture the world in 1922. It was a world reeling from the trauma of the First World War. A society grappling with immense loss and disillusionment. Into this bleak landscape came the story of a fragile young king, whose memory was protected not by force, but by care. His tomb offered a narrative not of triumph, but of continuity. Not of brutal conquest, but of quiet endurance. Even the spectacular gold took on a new meaning. In that post-war context, it wasn't just celebrated as immense wealth, it was seen as a symbol of survival. These glittering treasures were proof that something beautiful, something precious, could make it through devastation completely intact. In a world desperately trying to rebuild itself, that message was incredibly powerful. Tutankhamun became a symbol of history itself, hidden, vulnerable, but ultimately recoverable. As his fame exploded, his image traveled the globe. The golden mask became one of the most recognizable icons on the planet. But what truly ensured his lasting legacy was the silence behind that mask. Because his life was so short and his records so sparse, he became a blank canvas. This ambiguity invited interpretation. Scholars debated his politics, artists imagined his life, and audiences everywhere projected their own hopes, fears, and dreams onto the boy king. Each generation found something new in his story, something that spoke to their own time. This constant reinterpretation has kept him alive and relevant. Yet, for all the myths and speculation, the tomb itself acted as an anchor to reality. No matter how wild the theories became, the physical evidence was always there. The walking sticks remained. The hastily decorated walls remained. The fragile bones of the king himself remained. The story could be sensationalized, but the core truth could not be erased. The artifacts grounded the legend in tangible fact. This brings us to a bigger question about how we measure historical importance. History tends to reward dominance and power, but human memory, what we choose to hold on to, rewards meaning. Tutankhamun's life was brief and constrained, but it carried immense emotional weight. His tomb preserved not a list of achievements, but an intention. It showed how a society responded to vulnerability, how it cared for one of its own. In that sense, Tutankhamun is remembered not for what he did in life, but for how he was treated in death. The incredible care embedded in his burial created a narrative far stronger than any carved inscription. It communicated a civilization's values more clearly than any towering monument. His tomb gives us a rare glimpse into the ethics of ancient Egypt. It reveals what they believed was worth protecting, and it forces us to ask ourselves if our own societies would show the same level of care. So, the fame of the boy king is no accident. It's the result of deep, human resonance. His story touches on universal themes that we all grapple with: youth, illness, mortality, and the profound hope that after we're gone, someone will care enough to remember us, to preserve our story. Today, as his artifacts tour the world in blockbuster exhibitions and documentaries retell his tale, there's a risk of simplifying his legacy down to just the glittering gold. But if we look closer, beneath the shine, a more profound truth remains, a truth that can't be polished away. Greatness does not always have to roar. It doesn't always come from conquest or earth-shattering power. Sometimes, greatness whispers, and in that quiet whisper, Tutankhamun endures. Not as a god, not as a conqueror, but as a powerful reminder that legacy can be built from care, and that even the most fragile lives can leave the deepest marks on time. When Howard Carter peered into Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he uttered the now famous words, "I see wonderful things." But in that very moment of discovery, a question was born that has haunted archaeology ever since. Should the tomb have been opened at all? The ancient Egyptians believed that disturbing the dead was a grave violation, threatening not just the soul of the departed, but the very balance of the world. Modern science, of course, dismissed this as mere superstition. Yet, the consequences of that intrusion have been far more complex and enduring than anyone could have imagined. The tomb's greatest strength was its perfect preservation. For over 3,000 years, it lay sealed in an environment of darkness, dryness, and absolute stillness. This delicate balance preserved everything: wood, paint, linen, even the pharaoh's flesh. But the moment light and air flooded in, that equilibrium was shattered. The clock started ticking. Colors that had remained vibrant for millennia began to fade. Organic materials started to weaken. The tomb, which had defied the passage of 30 centuries, began to age rapidly, not over hundreds of years, but in mere decades. This reveals an uncomfortable truth at the heart of archaeology. Discovery and destruction are often two sides of the same coin. To reveal history is to irrevocably change it. Every breath a visitor takes alters the humidity. Every footstep stirs up ancient dust. Every flash of a camera exposes delicate surfaces to damaging light. Even the most careful, methodical excavation is, by its very nature, an act of transformation. Tutankhamun's tomb forced archaeologists to confront this reality head-on. In the early days, conservation methods were primitive. Objects were removed to be studied, stabilized, and put on display. But this separation came at a steep price. The original context was lost forever. The intricate relationships between artifacts, so carefully arranged by ancient hands, were dissolved. The tomb's narrative, once a complete and sacred story, became fragmented, scattered across museums and private collections around the world. Ethical standards in archaeology have evolved, but it's been a slow, painful process. In the early 20th century, the field was driven by a spirit of exploration that often bordered on treasure hunting. Artifacts were seen as trophies of knowledge, symbols of national prestige. Cultural sensitivity was, to put it mildly, not a priority. Today, the conversation is completely different. The field grapples with complex issues of restitution, in situ preservation, and profound respect for cultural heritage. Tutankhamun's tomb stands at the very center of this evolution, powerful case study in both the triumphs of discovery and the deep regrets of our past actions. The boy king's body itself embodies this tension. Early examinations of the mummy, driven by scientific curiosity but limited by the techniques of the time, were incredibly destructive. The sacred resins used in mummification had fused the linen wrappings directly to the flesh, making their removal a brutal process. Limbs were broken. The body was dismembered. Pieces were separated and analyzed. These actions weren't malicious. They were performed in the pursuit of knowledge. But good intentions don't erase the consequences. The damage was done, and it leaves us with a deeply unsettling question. Did we learn enough to justify the harm that was caused? Some will argue that without Carter's excavation, Tutankhamun would have remained an anonymous footnote in history, his story silent beneath the desert sands. Science would have gained nothing. The world would be poorer for it. But others counter that the knowledge we gained came at the cost of the king's dignity, and that perhaps some histories, some final resting places, deserve to remain sealed. This isn't just an abstract philosophical debate. It directly shapes modern archaeological policy. Today, access to the original tomb is severely restricted. High-fidelity replica chambers have been built for tourists. The lighting inside the real tomb is precisely controlled. State-of-the-art conservation labs work tirelessly to slow the decay. All these measures are an attempt to reconcile our insatiable curiosity with our growing sense of responsibility. They are a tacit admission that true preservation often requires restraint. The saga of Tutankhamun's tomb also forces us to ask, who owns the past? The artifacts legally and morally belong to Egypt, yet their influence has become undeniably global. Exhibitions of his treasures travel the world, drawing massive crowds. The serene golden face of his death mask is one of the most recognized images on the planet. His legacy is shared by all of humanity, but the control over that legacy, and the physical remains of it, remains a point of contention. You exploit a resource. You respect a relationship. Tutankhamun's tomb challenges us to choose which path we will take. The ancient Egyptians viewed burial as a sacred contract between the living and the dead. To disturb a tomb was to break that contract, inviting spiritual consequences. Modern society replaced that spiritual fear with scientific justification. We told ourselves that the pursuit of knowledge outweighed the ancient taboos. And yet, the ethical discomfort lingers. When you look at it this way, the famous curse of the pharaohs reads less like a genuine fear of supernatural punishment, and more like a deep-seated anxiety about our own wrongdoing. It's the ghost of a guilty conscience. The tomb also reminds us that silence has its own value. Not everything needs to be exposed to the light of day to have meaning. Some truths, some stories, are perhaps best preserved when left untouched, shrouded in the mystery they were intended to have. The real challenge for us, as inheritors of this legacy, is to learn when our curiosity serves a genuine quest for understanding, and when it simply serves our own ego. As modern conservation efforts intensify, the tomb itself becomes less and less accessible to the public. These restrictions can be frustrating for tourists who dream of seeing it with their own eyes, but they are absolutely essential to protect the fragile materials within. This tension perfectly mirrors the larger debate, the constant struggle between access and preservation. Tutankhamun's tomb teaches us a hard lesson. Access is often fleeting, but the damage from it can be permanent. Preservation, if we commit to it, can be enduring. Perhaps the most profound lesson from the boy king's tomb is one of humility. It survived for millennia not because of some grand design, but simply because it was overlooked. Its discovery was a historical accident. It was never intended for us, and that accident confers a tremendous responsibility upon us. If we truly want to honor the boy king and his culture, we must resist the urge to endlessly consume his story, to pick apart his legacy until nothing is left. The ethics of excavation don't demand that we remain in ignorance. They demand that we act with care. Care in our methods, care in our intentions. and care in the stories we choose to tell. As we approach the end of this journey into the tomb's legacy, one final truth emerges. The greatest treasure that Tutankhamun's tomb has given the world is the glittering gold, or the invaluable scientific data. It's a matter of perspective. It forces us to slow down, to listen to the echoes of the past, and to recognize that history isn't some inert collection of facts and objects. It's a living, breathing, and incredibly fragile thing. And in that fragility, in that vulnerability, we find a reflection of ourselves. When we stand at the edge of Tutankhamun's story, we realize his tomb isn't just about ancient Egypt. It's about how we, as humans, face impermanence. If you strip away all the gold, take away the layers of myth, what's left is a question that echoes across centuries. What do we truly leave behind, and who gets to decide how it's remembered? Tutankhamun never chose his own legacy. Like most of us, his life ended long before it could be fully defined. His memory was shaped by others: priests, embalmers, and officials, all working under intense pressure, a mix of fear and devotion. They carefully constructed a version of him that they believed could survive for eternity. And in doing so, they revealed their own values, their own hopes and fears. Fast forward to today, and we're doing the exact same thing. We project our own meanings onto his tomb, interpreting its glittering contents through our modern lenses. Every era seems to reshape Tutankhamun to fit its own needs. To some, he's a profound mystery. To others, a medical case study. To many more, he's an icon of timeless beauty. But each of these interpretations says just as much about us as it does about him. The tomb reminds us that memory is never static. It's alive, it evolves. The objects themselves endure, but their meaning shifts over time. The famous golden mask, once meant as a spiritual shield for the afterlife, now serves as a global symbol of history and art. The walking sticks, once used to support a young king with a physical ailment, now carry the weight of a complex narrative. This transformation is inevitable, but it comes with a great responsibility. Tutankhamun's life was short, his reign constrained. He never became the monumental figure his culture might have hoped for. And yet, in death, he achieved something incredibly rare: continuity. His tomb bridged a gap not just between life and death, but between worlds, between eras. It preserved a single, powerful moment of human care, long enough for it to reach us, thousands of years later. This idea of continuity challenges our modern assumptions about success. We often think in terms of grand achievements, of empires and influence, but achievements fade, empires collapse. What truly endures are the subtle traces of intention. And in this way, the tomb becomes a profound lesson in dignity. It is the conscious decision to treat a life as worthy of care, even when that life is fragile, even when it can no longer defend itself. But from the quiet, painstaking accumulation of care that was given to him after he was gone, his tomb doesn't speak loudly with tales of conquest. It speaks persistently, in a whisper, about compassion. And of course, there is grief here. The tomb is fundamentally an artifact of mourning. The seemingly hurried construction, the crowded chambers, the almost obsessive layers of protection, all of these things point to a community grappling with a sudden, unexpected loss. Grief makes us seek control when we feel we have none. The tomb is that desire for control, transformed into a permanent structure. We recognize this instinct, don't we? We build monuments for our loved ones, we preserve their belongings, we tell and retell their stories. Tutankhamun's tomb is just an ancient, magnificent version of this universal human response. It connects us to people who lived and died long ago through the shared, timeless emotion of loss. So, as we explore this story, the question shifts. It's no longer just about what the tomb reveals, but what it demands from us. It asks us to reconsider how we treat the past. Do we rush to put everything on display, or do we pause to truly understand? Do we simplify complex histories into easy sound bites, or do we have the patience to sit with their complexity? That profound silence allowed the original intention, the care, the grief, the hope to outlast time itself. Perhaps our task today is not to fill that silence with our own noise, but to learn how to listen to it. Ultimately, Tutankhamun's story doesn't offer easy answers. It offers reflection. It invites us to see vulnerability not as a failure, but as a fundamental human condition that is worthy of care. It suggests that a memory shaped by empathy can endure far longer than a memory shaped by power. As we imagine the chambers closing once more, as the glint of gold dims and the silence returns, one truth remains crystal clear. The tomb was never really about wealth. It was about protection. It was about holding something fragile, something precious, against the vast, unforgiving expanse of time. And in that singular act, the ancient Egyptians succeeded beyond anything they could have possibly imagined. They preserved not just a body, not just a treasure, but a message, one that still speaks, quietly and clearly, to those of us willing to listen. In the end, Tutankhamun's tomb asks for nothing more than quiet understanding. After all the gold has dazzled, after the myths have faded, after science has spoken its piece, what truly remains is stillness, the very kind of stillness that was intended from the very beginning. The ancient Egyptians didn't fear death as a final ending. What they feared was disruption. They feared being forgotten. To them, eternity wasn't about endless time, it was about uninterrupted order. Tutankhamun's tomb was constructed to preserve that sacred order, not to impress strangers thousands of years in the future. Its ultimate success, then, lies in how long it remained untouched, a silent sentinel in the Valley of the Kings. When we imagine that tomb being resealed, the final stone sliding perfectly into place, we can almost feel the intention behind that act. Hands withdrew, voices faded into the desert air, darkness returned to the chamber, and the boy king was alone again, but he was not abandoned. He was surrounded by preparation, by care that had been solidified into matter itself. The world outside moved on without him, but his space, his world, remained complete. That kind of completeness is incredibly rare. Most lives, most stories, scatter to the winds. Objects are lost, memories fracture and fade. But Tutankhamun's story, through a unique combination of chance and circumstance, remained whole long enough to meet us, fully intact. And when it did, it reminded us of something we so often forget in our noisy world. Silence can preserve what noise destroys. This tomb doesn't celebrate conquest or military might. It doesn't glorify dominance or power. It doesn't demand our reverence. Instead, it offers a quiet, profound inventory of concern. Every single object within its walls answers a question that no one can now hear. Every layer of burial exists because someone, somewhere, worried about what might go wrong on the other side. What if he cannot walk? Let's give him walking sticks. What if he is cold? Let's provide him with fine linens. What if he is afraid in the dark? What if, most tragically, he is forgotten? These unspoken questions echo through the chambers far more clearly than any carved inscription. They reveal a deeply human side to this ancient civilization. Tutankhamun's greatest legacy isn't his iconic golden mask, or his nested coffins, or even his global fame. His true legacy is the tangible proof that care leaves traces, that focused attention, once given, can outlast even the greatest power. It shows us that a fragile, short life, when treated with seriousness and profound respect, can speak clearly across millennia. Today, as modern visitors step into meticulously crafted replicas of the tomb, guided by artificial lights and protective glass, they encounter echoes rather than true presence. The real tomb, in its sealed quietude, resists this kind of gaze. It asks for restraint. It reminds us that some sacred spaces were meant to be felt with the soul, not just consumed with the eyes. And perhaps that is the final, most important lesson. History is not only something to be unearthed and revealed, it is something to be held gently, with respect. Tutankhamun's tomb survived for over 3,000 years precisely because it was left alone. Its true meaning survives today, when we choose to listen to its silence rather than just extract its treasures. The boy king never knew that the entire world would one day speak his name. He never knew his face would become an immortal symbol of ancient Egypt. He never knew that his physical weakness in life would become his source of endurance in death. Yet here he remains, not as a powerful ruler commanding our attention, but as a quiet human presence inviting our reflection. Time broke its silence once, when Howard Carter peered into the darkness and saw wonderful things. It does not need to do so again. If we can allow the story to close, to settle back into its intended peace, to rest where it truly belongs, Tutankhamun returns to what he was always meant to be, not a spectacle, not a warning, but a quiet, enduring testament to care. And in that profound silence, history can finally breathe more easily. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the past. If you found this perspective meaningful, consider subscribing for more stories that look beyond the surface.